Suicide is the second leading cause of death of people between the age of 10 and 34. As journalists, we have an obligation to report on an issue with such a broad impact. Like many topics that journalists report on, suicide is a sensitive issue and should be treated with respect, and should be carefully navigated to ensure that the public is provided with the facts, but also making sure that families and loved ones' interests are taken into account. Reporting on suicide in the wrong way can inspire others to also take their own lives, and may also be detrimental to the families and loved ones of the deceased. Media professionals often make mistakes in dealing with this subject. Mistakes like using inappropriate terminology and vocabulary, or romanticizing the event. This video will help explain the detriments of these mistakes, and others. Use this video as a guideline for how to report on tragic events of suicide, and take the terminology and information you learn here to help yourself and others become better media professionals. One of the main challenges that journalists face when reporting on events like suicide is deciding what type of language to use sensitively, but truthfully to report on the issue. To many, the language that is used may not seem like such an impactful factor, but more than 50 studies have shown that improper reporting on suicide can result in suicide contagion. This term, suicide contagion, also referred to as copycat suicide, is a term used to describe the phenomenon where people take their own life after being inspired by another person doing the same. In 2014, after Robin Williams' suicide, suicides by the same method increased by 32% in the months after. People who are affected by this tend to already be vulnerable individuals who are already struggling with many other aspects of their lives. Misreporting on suicide can be the final factor that may push such vulnerable individuals to take their own lives. As not just journalists, but as human beings, our obligation to the public goes so far as to ensure that we do not cause further harm to these people, and that we provide an avenue for mental health and support. One mistake that journalists commonly make is sensationalizing the event of suicide and the impact that it has. Try to avoid using photos or videos of the location that the suicide occurred. Additionally, using photos of grieved loved ones, memorial or funeral services, and overall playing to the emotional aspect of the event is a mistake you should be careful to avoid. Instead, try to use photos of the family or other loved ones, or other positive images that relate to the person's life. In a report prepared by the CDC, it was stated that sensationalist reporting of suicide has been shown to increase the effects of suicide contagion. While there is an important journalistic aspect to the effect of suicide, its overall connotation should not be used in any way to try and increase viewership or receive attention. The public's heightened preoccupation with news regarding suicide is inevitable, but its effect can be minimized by excluding gruesome details about someone's death and avoid using images and videos that show explicit details of the event. By using detailed language to describe the manner in which someone died is also a bad way of reporting suicide, because it takes the focus away from the real issue of mental health and instead dramatizes the event as a whole. A very common pitfall that media professionals fall victim to is glorifying the act of suicide by showing too much of the people's or community's displays of adoration after someone's death. While this as a whole is not wrong, in excess it can inspire people to take their own lives, because they may find the adoration in the afterlife more appealing to them as compared to what they may currently be going through. As journalists, our main loyalty is to the public. The main message of any report on suicide should be to educate and encourage people to get help when they need it, by providing helpful sources. Suicide is a very sensitive subject to report on, and when reporting to the public, we must cover all of our bases. It is very easy to exclusively report on the suicide itself and why it happened, but we must not neglect information or how to reach out for support and potentially prevent further harm. As discussed earlier, certain types of suicide in news coverage can increase the likeliness of suicide in vulnerable individuals. Taking too much time describing the scene and how it happened and the intricate details of death can be detrimental to those struggling. This is when we must be especially careful in our discussion of the death, as well as report on the helplines, outreach, and signs and symptoms. As journalists, we must turn to suicide reporting into a way to educate others and how to get help, rather than inspire. Another challenge journalists face when reporting a suicide is vocabulary usage. It is very easy to mess up the correct way to use this terminology, especially when you're dealing with such a fragile case. Journalists may be more fixed on the reporting aspect and getting the story out quickly, instead of making sure they're taking the time to be thorough and concise about what they are putting out for the public to see. Avoid words like commit, as it holds a highly negative connotation. The word commit denotes a crime or a sin. The profession has moved away from using that word with suicide. Instead of shaming or looking at it as if someone has done wrong, look at it as a mental health issue. The preferred term is completed suicide or died by suicide. Also avoid using phrases like suffering with mental illness and victim of mental illness as well. It suggests an individual may be referred to as experiencing or being treated for or has a history of mental illness. If we continue using the wrong verbiage, viewers that are watching or listening may in fact increase the likelihood of their own suicide, especially for those who are vulnerable. The common misconception that people think is that suicide is caused by a single shocking event, such as the loss of a job or a relationship or death of someone close. Mental illness is a key factor in almost all suicides. According to CBS News, more than 90% of people who kill themselves are grappling with clinical depression, substance abuse, or another mental health problem. A crisis of some sort might trigger a suicide, but only when someone's finger is already on the trigger. It is important to know that suicide is not caused by a single event, and that it is not typically out of the blue. Most of the time, these people have things going on in their life, and they don't know how to cope with all of the emotions they are feeling. Both negative and positive events can be sources of significant stress. Examples of events that can cause positive stress include marriage, moving, having a child, or changing jobs. But examples of negative stress can include losses, health problems, relationships, debts, and peer pressure. Overall, the issue of suicide is very complex, and reporting on this issue and its effects is equally as complex. It should be approached with a high level of scrutiny and discrepancy. As media professionals, it is our job to provide valuable information to the public, while also respecting the privacy and interests of all parties involved. Part of reporting on suicide is also providing information for those who may be struggling with the issue themselves.